The engine sat on its cradle like a verdict already signed. 4 diagnostic checkpoints, 3 engineers. One conclusion: scrap it. Nobody looked back. Nobody, except Jackson Reed standing in the corner of the maintenance bay at 11 o'clock at night, a flashlight in one hand and 4 years of self-taught knowledge in the other. His eyes stopped on a detail no larger than his thumb that the entire diagnostic system had walked right past. It was not instinct. It was the kind of attention that only grows in the quiet hours after a child falls asleep, in the glow of a tablet screen, with a maintenance manual open and nowhere else to be. And it was about to force a $200 million company to stop everything and look itself in the mirror. That $27 part changed everything, but first they had to fire him. The Denver maintenance hangar smelled the same way it always did at 5:45 in the morning. Jet fuel, cold aluminum, and the particular stillness that exists before the first shift arrives and fills the space with noise. The fluorescent lights overhead threw a yellow-white glow across the concrete floor, catching the edges of toolboxes and wing stands and the long shadows of aircraft waiting to be cleared for the day. Jackson Reed pulled his badge through the reader at the south entrance and stepped inside exactly 22 minutes before his shift was scheduled to begin. He did this every morning, not because he was told to, not because anyone was watching, but because those 22 minutes belonged to him in a way that the rest of the workday did not. He would walk the floor slowly, touching nothing, reading everything. Near Bay 7, a loose coupling nut on a colleague's tool cart caught his eye. It was not his cart, not his station, not his responsibility. He picked up the wrench, tightened it, replaced the wrench, and kept walking. That was Jackson Reed. He was 29 years old and had been working as a Level 3 aircraft maintenance technician at Skybridge Regional Airways for 4 years, since the week after his wife's funeral. He did not think of the timing as meaningful, he thought of it as necessary. The hospital bills from her final 6 weeks had not waited for him to grieve, and neither had the rent on the 1-bedroom apartment in Aurora where he and his daughter lived, and so he had taken the job because he knew engines, and because Skybridge was hiring, and because standing still felt worse than moving. His daughter Bonnie was 6 years old and slept deeply in the way that small children do, as though the world outside her bedroom had nothing to do with her yet. On mornings before dawn, he would place her lunch in the refrigerator and leave a small folded drawing on the counter beside it, a rabbit, a cloud, a lopsided star, and then close the front door quietly and drive to the hangar in the dark. He did not wake her. He told himself she needed the sleep more than she needed the goodbye. Skybridge Regional Airways operated a fleet of 40 aircraft out of Denver International and served 23 secondary markets across the Mountain West and Southwest. It was not a large carrier by national standards, but it was profitable, it had a clean safety record, and it had been growing steadily for 6 consecutive quarters under the leadership of Evelyn Marsh, who had taken the chief executive position at 32 after her father's retirement, and had spent every day since proving that the succession was not a gift but a result. She was 34 now, and the company's current fleet modernization program, a structured plan to replace or overhaul the oldest third of the aircraft over 18 months, was her signature initiative. She had presented it to the board with 3 hours of data and walked out with full authorization. The program gave the company forward momentum. It also, as it turned out, created the conditions for everything that followed. Adrian Cole had been director of operations at Skybridge for 7 years. He moved through the hangar the way certain people move through rooms they consider beneath them, in a fitted suit, badge clipped to his lapel without the standard technician lanyard, never touching the aircraft, always appearing near decisions that involved large numbers. Jackson had noticed him the way you notice a recurring variable in an equation: present, significant, not fully explained. When Adrian walked through the maintenance floor that morning while Jackson was finishing his pre-shift walkthrough, he did not look at the equipment. He looked at the schedule board. Then he looked at the clock. Then he walked away without acknowledging anyone on the floor. The quarterly performance review cycle was 3 months out. If Jackson achieved a Level 4 rating, his annual salary would increase by $9,000, enough, combined with what he had managed to save, to finally close the gap on what remained of his wife's hospital debt. He did not talk about the debt or the second job he worked on weekends doing mobile oil changes in apartment parking lots. He tightened loose nuts that were not his responsibility and read engine manuals past midnight and arrived 22 minutes early because that was the only kind of person he knew how to be. N4471 came back to the hangar on a Tuesday evening with a crew write-up that read in the precise and understated language of aviation documentation, Engine 2 anomaly observed during cruise phase, Denver to Salt Lake City. The captain had described an irregular vibration in the starboard engine lasting approximately 40 seconds before the instrumentation stabilized on its own. There had been no emergency, no diversion, no injuries. The aircraft had landed normally, and the crew had filed their report before heading to the hotel. By the time the evening shift picked it up, the machine was in Bay 11 with its cowlings open and 2 technicians running the standard FedEx diagnostic sequence. The results came back in sequence. First test cycle, compressor stall protection activated. Second cycle, same result. Third cycle, same. The system generated its automatic classification, unrecoverable, and the decision chain was set in motion. The technical meeting the following morning was held in Conference Room B on the second floor of the operations building. A room with a dry erase board, a projector that flickered every few minutes, and a long table with 12 chairs. Cameron Walsh, the chief maintenance officer, ran the meeting. He was 38 years old, careful with language, thorough in process, and genuinely competent at the administrative architecture of aircraft maintenance. The sign-off chains, the documentation protocols, the regulatory filings. He presented the FADEC data clearly. 3 consecutive test cycles, identical fault pattern, automatic system classification as unrecoverable. The manual supported the finding. The documentation was clean. He moved through the slides without hesitation, and the room received each point with the nods of people who have no basis to disagree and no incentive to try. Adrian Cole sat at the head of the table. He was not listed on the meeting agenda. He had simply arrived, taken the chair at the end, and placed his phone face down in front of him with the particular stillness of someone who does not need to perform authority because they already possess it. When Cameron finished, Adrian asked a question shaped like a question but functioning as a direction. Given the timeline pressure from the modernization program, and given that a complete replacement resolves this cleanly, is there any technical argument against proceeding with procurement? Cameron said there was not. The other engineers around the table said nothing. The silence in that room cost $4,200,000. The engine was classified as scrap. A purchase order was initiated for a refurbished CFM 56-7B unit from Meridian Engine Solutions, $4,200,000, with a 30% deposit due within 72 hours and an 11-week delivery window. The room agreed this was the correct outcome and dispersed to their next obligations. Jackson sat in the second-to-last row, one of 2 Level 3 technicians present, included because he had been the lead inspector on N4471's most recent maintenance cycle. He held a printed copy of the diagnostic report on his lap and read the numbers in sequence as Cameron spoke, and something in the pattern caught the edge of his attention the way a slightly out-of-tune note catches a musician's ear. Not loud, not wrong enough to name immediately, just present and persistent and refusing to go away. He raised his hand. Adrian Cole turned to look at him with an expression of complete professional patience. "Thank you, Jackson," Adrian said before Jackson had spoken a word. "We have sufficient data to proceed." The room's attention returned to the table. Jackson lowered his hand, folded the report, and put it in the front pocket of his work shirt. He drove home that evening, put Bonnie's dinner in the microwave, and after she was asleep, opened the CFM technical manual on his tablet and started from the beginning. It was just past 11 o'clock when Jackson found it. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the maintenance manual open to Chapter 73, Fuel and Control Systems, CFM 56-7B, and he had been reading with a highlighter and a legal pad for 2.5 hours. The fault isolation section was dense and cross-referenced, written in the layered technical language of documents designed to be consulted rather than read, but Jackson had been reading things like this for 4 years, slowly and carefully, in exactly the way he read them now. All 3 test cycle fault events on N4471 had shown the same upstream anomaly. In the milliseconds before any compressor-related response, the P2/T2 fuel pressure transducer had reported a signal voltage that fell 0.3 volts below the established threshold for normal fuel pressure. The FedEx system, the engine's digital control unit, had received that signal, interpreted it as indicating insufficient fuel pressure, and in response had initiated the stall protection sequence. The sequence had run correctly. The logic had executed perfectly. The only problem was that the input was wrong. Jackson wrote on his legal pad, it did not stall, it thought it was stalling. He turned to the fault isolation procedure for the P2/T2 transducer and found what he was looking for in Section 73-21-08, a documented failure mode involving galvanic corrosion at the electrical connector housing, specifically affecting the signal-carrying contact pins, producing a voltage degradation in the range of 0.2 to 0.4 volts below nominal. That was precisely the range that would cause FADEC to initiate stall protection. The manual described the failure mode as more likely in aircraft operating frequent short-cycle routes in high-humidity environments. Exactly the profile of a regional carrier making multiple daily legs across the Mountain West, where temperature swings between high-altitude cruise and low-elevation ground operations created the precise conditions for condensation to accumulate around connector housings over time. Jackson read the paragraph 3 times. He had not written this. He had not invented it. It was sitting in the manual, documented and indexed, available to anyone who looked. The transducer itself, the component responsible for reading fuel pressure and transmitting that reading to the control unit, was a cylindrical unit approximately the size of a large vitamin bottle, weighing 80 grams, threaded into the engine casing near the fuel control unit. Its part number was 15960-3. Its catalog price was $27.40. It was in stock at the Denver Parts Warehouse, and the replacement procedure required removal of one connector, one threaded fitting, and 40 minutes of labor. Jackson sat for a long moment with his pen against the legal pad. Then he picked up his keys. Owen Babbitt had been a maintenance technician at Skybridge for 24 years. 52 years old, methodical, the kind of person who knew where every component in the warehouse had been since the day it arrived. He was working the overnight shift when Jackson appeared at the warehouse door, and he listened without interrupting while Jackson laid out the voltage signature, the fault isolation entry, the transducer, the price. Owen stood with his coffee cup and said nothing until Jackson finished. Then he asked, "You understand what that engine is worth?" It was not a question, and you know who owns Meridian. Jackson had not known that second part. Owen told him, Meridian Engine Solutions was co-owned by the brother-in-law of Adrian Cole, a fact not widely discussed inside Skybridge, but not hidden either, in the way that many uncomfortable things are not hidden but simply not named in rooms where decisions are made. Owen led Jackson through the warehouse to the staging area where the engine sat on a transport cradle, tagged for shipment to a disassembly facility the following week. Jackson found the transducer housing with his flashlight and examined the connector. Even under limited light, the corrosion was visible. A pale blue-green oxidation on both signal pins, the characteristic color of galvanic degradation between dissimilar metals in a moisture-rich environment. He connected a multimeter to the connector pins and measured the electrical resistance. The reading was 12% above specification. In a component whose entire function was to transmit a precise analog signal, a 12% resistance variance was not an anomaly. It was a failure. The entire diagnostic sequence, every fault event, every protective shutdown, every piece of data that had been presented in Conference Room B had been generated not by a failing engine but by a failing sensor smaller than his fist that cost less than a dinner for two. He photographed everything. The corrosion under the flashlight with a ruler in frame, the multimeter display with the connector attached, the part number stamped on the housing, and finally the tag on the engine cradle, the one that said scrap. Then he drove home, wrote up his findings on 4 pages of engineering paper with careful cross-references to the fault isolation manual, and was asleep before 3 in the morning for the first time in a week. He submitted the report the next morning through the standard internal technical review process. The correct form, the correct routing, 4 pages of findings with 12 photographs attached, delivered to Cameron Walsh's inbox by 7:15. The subject line read, Request for Secondary Diagnostic Review, P2/T2 Transducer Fault Isolation, Engine Number 7 B-4471-2. He had taken care with every word. The terminology matched the maintenance manual exactly. The fault isolation section reference was included, the part number and measured resistance variance were clearly stated, and the photographs were labeled and sequenced. It was, by any technical standard, a thorough and professionally constructed document. He filed it and went to work on the brake assembly in Bay 4. He did not hear from Cameron Walsh until the afternoon. The response arrived at his workstation by 2:30, a formal written notice citing 3 specific procedural violations: unauthorized access to a restricted storage area outside assigned shift hours, physical contact with equipment classified as pending disposal without supervisory authorization, and generation of unofficial technical documentation without standing to conduct a review. 3 violations. 10-day unpaid suspension effective immediately with a formal notation in his personnel file. The performance review cycle would proceed without him. The Level 4 evaluation would be deferred to the following cycle, 6 months away. Jackson was called into Adrian Cole's office at 3 o'clock. Adrian sat behind a glass-top desk with nothing on it except a folder and a pen. The HR representative sat to the side and said nothing throughout. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not express frustration or irritation. He spoke in the measured, precise tone of someone who has made these decisions before and learned that calmness is more effective than anger in every professional context. He outlined the 3 violations methodically, acknowledged that Jackson's interest in the technical outcome was understandable, and expressed appreciation for his commitment to fleet safety. Then he pushed the suspension notice across the desk. "The company values your contributions," he said. "We hope to have you back in a productive capacity following the review period." Jackson looked at the paper, then at Adrian. "I have 12 photographs," he said. "I have resistance measurements. The transducer is corroded and it was generating false signal data. The engine is not damaged." Adrian folded his hands on the desk. "The engine has been assessed by qualified personnel through the established diagnostic protocol," he said. "The outcome was appropriate to the findings." Jackson said nothing for a moment. He looked at the notice again. Then he said, "How much of the deposit has already cleared?" Adrian did not answer. He gestured toward the door with the small, conclusive movement of someone ending a meeting they were always going to end. Jackson walked out of the operations building and stood in the corridor, looking through the floor-to-ceiling window that faced the main apron. 40 feet below, an aircraft was being pushed back from the gate for an afternoon departure. He could see the tail number from where he stood, one of the fleet's older 737s, assigned to a short western regional route. He had worked on that aircraft. He knew its maintenance history and its last 3 service cycles. He stood at the window for approximately 90 seconds, watching it until it turned onto the taxiway and disappeared from his line of sight. The suspension meant no income for 10 days, a personnel record with adverse notations, and a performance cycle reset that pushed the Level 4 evaluation back 6 months. Someone had read 4 pages of documented technical findings, looked at 12 photographs of corroded connector pins, and responded not with a technical answer but with a procedural penalty. He was not surprised in the way people are surprised by things they did not see coming. He was surprised in the way people are surprised by things they had hoped, despite the evidence would not come. There was a difference, and he had learned to recognize it. 6 days into the suspension, on a Thursday afternoon, Jackson's flight tracking application flagged an alert. He used the app the way some people use the radio, not to find specific information but to stay connected to the pattern of things, the rhythm of departures and arrivals that had structured his professional life for 4 years. The alert was a 7700 squawk from Skybridge Flight 218, Denver to Albuquerque, which had declared an emergency at 28,000 feet over southern Colorado and begun an immediate diversion to Colorado Springs Airport. Flight 218 was operated by a Boeing 737 registered N4489. Jackson knew that aircraft. It was in the same fleet block as N4471, maintained by the same crews, fitted with the same engine variant. He set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a long moment. The diversion landed safely. There were no injuries, no structural damage, no loss of life. The 114 passengers deplaned through the jetway with their carry-on luggage and were rebooked onto connecting flights. The crew filed their reports with the professionalism of people trained to manage emergency situations without conveying the full weight of them to the people in the seats behind the cockpit door. The FAA regional office in Denver opened a preliminary inquiry within the hour, and a maintenance team was dispatched to Colorado Springs to take initial readings from the aircraft before it was repositioned. By early evening, Owen had sent Jackson a screenshot of the fault code extracted from N4489's maintenance system. P2/T2 transducer signal anomaly, voltage reading 0.28 volts below nominal threshold. Identical mechanism. Separate aircraft, separate component batch. The same failure producing the same false signal through the same digital logic, in a different engine, on a different route, 6 days after a 4-page report documenting exactly this failure mode had been received, reviewed, and answered with a suspension notice. Jackson read the screenshot twice. He put the phone in his pocket and stood at the window of his apartment, watching the parking lot, thinking about the 114 people who had been at 28,000 feet when the instrument reading went wrong. He thought about the altitude. He thought about the margin. He thought about the fact that FADEC had initiated its protective sequence before any mechanical damage occurred, which meant the system had worked, which meant the immediate outcome had been acceptable. He also thought about the fact that acceptable outcomes and resolved problems are not the same thing. The sensor mechanism was still in service. The fleet still had aircraft with the same engine variant and components aging in the same conditions, sourced from the same procurement cycle. He went back to the kitchen table and looked at his phone again. Inside Skybridge headquarters, the afternoon had ceased to be routine. Evelyn Marsh was in the building when the squawk alert came through, and she received the initial incident report within 40 minutes of the diversion landing and read it standing at her desk, and then read it again. She had been chief executive for 2 years, and she had managed labor negotiations and a fleet financing restructuring and a regional route expansion that required 3 separate regulatory filings, and she had handled all of it with the composed, data-driven authority she had decided would define her leadership. She had not managed 2 flight crew anomaly reports involving the same engine variant within 9 days. She called the operations leadership into the conference room on the executive floor and asked for a complete account. Adrian Cole presented the situation with methodical clarity. N4471 had been resolved through proper protocol. The Meridian replacement was in progress. N4489 was a separate incident. Preliminary indications did not suggest a systemic issue, and fleet maintenance intervals were current. He spoke for approximately 12 minutes and answered 4 follow-up questions, and by any surface measure, it was a professionally adequate performance. Evelyn listened to all of it. Then a question arrived in her mind the way certain questions do, not as a product of analysis but of pattern recognition, the specific unease that comes from looking at 2 data points and feeling a line forming between them. Is there any technical documentation from the N4471 review that was not incorporated into the final disposition report? The room was quiet for a moment. Cameron Walsh opened his laptop, navigated to the internal review file, located the submission by Jackson Reed, dated 9 days prior, 4 pages, 12 attachments, procedural status marked as dismissed, and printed it without asking permission or explaining what he was doing. He walked to the end of the table, placed it in front of Evelyn Marsh, and returned to his seat. He said nothing. It was the most significant action he would take in the entire proceeding, and it was performed in total silence. Evelyn read all 4 pages. She studied the photographs. She read the resistance measurements and the part number and the catalog price, $27.40. She turned to the last page and looked at the date stamp on the submission and then at the date stamp on the suspension notice. The sequence was 4 hours and 17 minutes. 4 hours and 17 minutes between a technically sound report entering the system and the person who filed it being removed from the building. She closed the document and looked up. "Find him," she said. "Tonight." Evelyn Marsh drove to Aurora herself. She had not called ahead through HR or dispatched an assistant or sent a formal letter of notification. She had taken the address from the personnel file, told her executive assistant she would be unavailable for 2 hours, and driven her own car through the evening traffic on Interstate 225 with the 4-page report on the passenger seat. She rang the doorbell at 7:48 in the evening, wearing a dark blue jacket over a collared shirt, hands in her pockets, looking like exactly what she was. Someone who had made a mistake and had come to say so in person rather than delegate the saying. They spoke in the doorway for the first several minutes. Jackson did not invite her in immediately, and she did not ask. She told him that she had read his report that evening and that she had not read it when it was submitted, and that she understood the difference between those 2 facts. She told him that she was not in a position to explain adequately why a documented technical finding had been processed as a procedural violation rather than a technical inquiry, but that she was in a position to acknowledge that it had happened and that it should not have. She did not frame it as an organizational failure or a systemic misalignment. She said, "You filed the right report. We gave you the wrong answer." Jackson was quiet for a moment. He asked one question. "When I file the next report," he said, "who reads it?" She said, "I do." He nodded once. He got his jacket. At the hangar, Jackson moved through the space with the ease of someone who had spent 4 years learning exactly where everything was, and he led the night crew to the engine cradle with the quiet authority of a person whose knowledge is simply present and visible rather than asserted. He directed the connector inspection on the P2/T2 transducer with Owen standing 2 feet away, and the technicians removed the connector housing and brought it under a magnification lamp. The galvanic corrosion was immediate and unmistakable. Blue-green crystalline oxidation on both signal contact pins, consistent with long-term moisture exposure in a dissimilar metal environment. The resistance measurement came back at 14.3% above specification, beyond the fault threshold established in the component maintenance manual. It was not ambiguous, it was not a matter of interpretation. The component had failed, the engine had not. Margaret Hale from the FAA Regional Office arrived the following morning with investigative authority covering both the N4489 diversion and any related fleet-wide issues. She was 58 years old and had been a federal aviation safety inspector for 22 years, and she brought to the hangar the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent 2 decades finding the small things that cause large consequences. She reviewed the N4471 technical file in its entirety, the original FDEC output, the disposition decision, Jackson's internal report, and the suspension notice. She documented the timeline, the date of Jackson's submission, the time of the disposition decision, the gap of 4 hours and 17 minutes. Then Owen Barrett appeared at her workstation at midday with a manila folder. He set it on the desk, took a breath, and said nothing further. Inside were printed copies of internal email correspondence between Adrian Cole and a procurement representative at Meridian Engine Solutions. The timestamps were significant not for what the emails said but for when they were sent. The first message confirming Meridian as the preferred replacement vendor for the CFM56 unit had been sent 2 days before the FADEC diagnostic test sequence on N4471 had been completed. The vendor had been selected before the engine had been fully evaluated. The conclusion had preceded the evidence. Margaret Hale read the emails twice, made her own copies, and placed them in her case file without expression. She had been doing this work long enough to know that the most damaging discoveries rarely arrived with drama. They arrived in manila folders, handed over quietly by people who had been carrying them for too long. The FAA initiated a procurement process integrity review within 48 hours of receiving Owen's documentation, covering not only the N447 disposition decision, but all procurement relationships and conflict of interest disclosures associated with fleet maintenance contracts over the preceding 4 years. It was a formal federal proceeding, methodical and unhurried, and its first visible consequence was a request for Adrian Cole's voluntary testimony at the regional FAA office. He arrived with an attorney and delivered his account in a sequence of careful, well-constructed statements. Accurate in their individual facts, reasonable in their individual framing. It was only when they were assembled chronologically alongside the email record that their cumulative meaning became visible. Meridian Engine Solutions was co-owned in part by Adrian's brother-in-law, a relationship disclosed in the initial vendor registration and covered by a conflict of interest waiver approved 3 years earlier on the basis that pricing was competitive and certifications were appropriate. What the waiver had not anticipated was the pattern: 3 separate replacement procurement decisions over 4 years, each following an abbreviated diagnostic timeline, each routing a 7-figure contract to Meridian. Considered individually, each decision had been defensible. Considered as a sequence, they described something else: a systematic compression of the diagnostic process at precisely the moments when a thorough analysis might have produced a different outcome. In the 4th instance, N4471, the compression had been aggressive enough that vendor selection had preceded diagnostic completion. That single fact, documented across 11 email timestamps, was the point at which the structure became impossible to explain in ways that were also true. Adrian Cole was placed on administrative leave pending the FAA review and a parallel internal investigation authorized by the Skybridge Board. The Meridian contract was suspended, the $1,260,000 deposit entered dispute proceedings, and a portion was ultimately recovered through negotiated settlement. Adrian left the building on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a leather bag and a personal coffee mug, and he did not return. There were no raised voices, no confrontation in the hallway. The end of his time at Skybridge was as managerially controlled and procedurally correct as his tenure had been, right up until the moment the timestamps made control impossible. Cameron Walsh submitted his resignation from the Chief Maintenance Officer role 10 days after the review began. Not under direct pressure, but because his letter stated simply that given the events of the preceding weeks, The role required someone who had not been part of the decision sequence, and that this was a conclusion he had reached independently and accepted without bitterness. He finished his final shift, updated his handover documentation thoroughly, and left the operations building through the same door he had entered for 6 years. Among those who knew the situation closely, the general assessment was that he had not been the architect of what happened, but had been its instrument. Not through malice, but through the particular failure of people who know what is being asked of them and comply anyway, because the alternative requires more courage than they have ready at that moment. His resignation was the only honest accounting he offered, and for most of those who knew the situation, it was considered sufficient. The engine that had sat on a transport cradle tagged for disassembly, formally classified as unrecoverable, its scrap designation generating a $4.2 million purchase order, was returned to the maintenance floor. Jackson replaced the P2/T2 transducer in 38 minutes using a part pulled from the warehouse stock. Part number 1159600-3, catalog price $27.40. He ran the FADEC test sequence. The engine started cleanly on the first cycle. It ran through the full diagnostic protocol without a single fault code. Margaret Hale signed the return to service documentation. The engine was cleared. The suspension was rescinded in writing. Every notation associated with it was removed from Jackson's personnel file, and the formal notification, a single page signed by Evelyn Marsh, used language that was precise rather than elaborate. The violation findings were without merit. The disciplinary action was reversed in its entirety, and the personnel record would reflect no adverse history from the period in question. It arrived on a Wednesday morning and was followed by a phone call from Evelyn's office, requesting his presence at a department-wide technical briefing that afternoon. Jackson read the notification once, folded it, and placed it in the same front pocket of his work shirt where he had carried the diagnostic report 3 weeks before. The briefing was held in the main training room on the ground floor of the operations building, a room with 40 chairs that had been filled with 60 people by the time Evelyn arrived. She walked to the front without materials, without a presentation, without notes. She stood at the front and spoke without preamble. She said that the company's technical review process had failed, that a report filed correctly by a qualified technician through the proper channel had been processed as an administrative infraction rather than a technical inquiry, and that this had occurred because the organizational environment at the time had treated financial efficiency as a higher priority than diagnostic rigor. She said that the fleet modernization program had created pressure, and that the pressure had been permitted to shape the review process, and that this was her responsibility as the person who had authorized the program and set its timeline. She said that a member of the technical staff had identified the correct failure mode, documented it thoroughly, and been suspended for doing so. She looked directly at Jackson, who stood in the third row with his arms crossed and said nothing. "He did everything right," she said. "We did not." She proposed a new position, lead technical analyst, maintenance systems review, a role created to provide an independent pathway for technical findings that existed outside the normal supervisory chain, with compensation equivalent to a Level 4 designation. When she finished, she looked at Jackson directly. The room waited. He raised his question from where he stood without moving to the front in the same quiet voice he used for everything. "When I file the next report," he said, "who reads it?" The room was quiet. "I do." He nodded once. He accepted. The P2/T2 fuel pressure transducer, part number 1159600-3, was added that same week to the mandatory semi-annual inspection checklist for all CFM 56-7B engines in the Skybridge fleet, filed with the FAA as a voluntary safety enhancement. It was a small entry in a maintenance document. It would be reviewed and signed by a technician every 6 months for as long as those engines flew. Almost no one would know where it had come from unless they looked for it, and almost no one would look. 3 weeks after the suspension was rescinded, N4471 was cleared for return to service. It had spent 31 days on the maintenance floor, tagged, re-examined, documented, and ultimately vindicated through the same process that had once condemned it. On the morning it was pushed out of the hangar and onto the taxiway for its engine run, Jackson stood near the entrance to Bay 11 and watched it go. Owen Barrett was beside him, hands in the pockets of his coveralls, not saying anything. The engine 2 cowling was closed and sealed. The aircraft was clean. The ground crew walked their safety perimeter and gave the signal, and the CFM started its ignition cycle. Fuel flow initiation, igniter spark. the building low-frequency surge as the turbine caught and climbed through its start sequence. The engine stabilized at idle. It ran without variance, without interruption, without a single anomalous voltage reading from the small cylindrical sensor, now seated cleanly in its housing, its contact pins unoxidized, its signal precise and faithful and true. It sounded like nothing unusual. It sounded exactly like an engine that had always been fine. It was the sound of a system working the way it was supposed to work. Not heroic, not remarkable, just correct. And in that moment, correctness was everything. Owen said nothing for a long time. Then he said, 40 minutes. Jackson did not answer. He understood exactly what that meant, and he did not need to say it. 40 minutes of labor, $27.40 in parts, 4 pages written at a kitchen table past midnight, and 12 photographs taken with a personal phone in a dark warehouse after hours. Against $4,200,000, a signed purchase order, a vendor relationship built over 4 years, and a procedural apparatus that had been designed, intentionally or otherwise, to make the correct answer unreachable. The distance between those two things was not technical. It was not financial. It was simply the distance between what a system sees when it is working as intended and what it misses when the wrong priorities are allowed to sit at the head of the table. Not complicated, just invisible, until one person refused to stop looking. That evening, Jackson went home and ate dinner at the kitchen table. Later, after the apartment had gone quiet, he stood at the door of Bonnie's room for a moment. She was asleep on her side with one arm over the edge of the mattress and her hair spread across the pillow, entirely unaware that anything in the world had changed or been fought over or set right. On the kitchen counter, propped against the salt shaker, was a drawing she had left for him when she got home from school. An airplane with very large engines, labeled in her handwriting with the words, "My dad's plane." He had found it when he walked in and had set it where he could see it from where he sat. He looked at his daughter for a long moment in the doorway, at the complete and uncomplicated safety of her sleep, and then he went to the living room, turned off the light, and sat in the dark for a while, not thinking about the report, not thinking about the engine, not thinking about Adrian Cole or the FAA review or the 4-page document that had changed the shape of the past month, just sitting quietly in a place that was his, that was safe, where everything that mattered was asleep down the hall. The engine had never needed to be replaced. It had only needed someone patient enough to hear the difference between a machine telling the truth and a machine reporting an error, and brave enough to trust that difference when no one else would listen.